Well, firstly, let me just say that there is a narrative, we've heard a little bit of it so far, that the publics of Europe are being led astray by talented demagogues. It's possible as well that the publics of Europe have seen a political class fail to get a grasp of very major things or even talk about them, and that the public have noticed facts. And that it's not that there's a meta-narrative that's going around, there are just facts. There are things that we can see with our eyes, there are things that are clear to us, which politicians daren't tread on. And I've had this experience throughout my life. I never forget the time, many years ago, I think when France first banned the headscarf. I've told this story before, of a Labour MP in a studio with me discussing the rights and wrongs of this, and spent the whole time with me. An Iranian friend of mine was also there, explaining why we were fascist and Islamophobic and so on for defending the French Republic's verdict on the headscarf. And we came out, and this Labour MP patted me on the back and said, "Never forget, Douglas, we're all with you." And I said, well, what was that all about on air? Which was the more pertinent moment. And he said, look, I've got a large Muslim constituency and I can't do anything in this area. And that's what you hear all the time in private. And the politicians, when I say this to them, their eyes go huge. They daren't tread onto this. But there's a very straightforward fact, I'm afraid, on this terrorism thing that has to be confronted. Extremism and violence can come from absolutely any community, pretty much. I mean, even Buddhists, when riled up in certain parts of the world, can become violent. The Quakers, I think, we can't go for, but but pretty much every community. So I accept that. This is not something to be picked up on. But Islamic extremism only comes from the Islamic religion and from followers of it. And that is an imported problem for Europe. That's a problem that we've brought in and we're now facing. Now, none of our politicians, by the way, and there's no great conspiracy about this, nobody expected it. If you'd have said to a politician in the 1990s, in the early years of the 2000s, Europe is going to be racked by blasphemy debates, they'd say, what are you talking about? When did the Spanish Inquisition return? And then we all became used to it, that there were certain things you couldn't do that were actually blasphemy in a country like this and were punishable effectively by death, by a death sentence. We all accepted that. And now we're told we have to accept the terrorism. Well, maybe we do have to accept the terrorism as part of our life, but the publics have a right to be looking at the politicians and saying, look, this is a problem you brought in. It's not only to be talked about. It's not only to be talked about as a problem, but unless we're willing to do that bit of identifying, to my mind, the gap between what the public can see and what the public know, and what the political class is even willing to whisper, will continue to grow, and that's the gap where you have to worry. First of all, sorry, Elif, but the burkini ban is a massive diversion. A massive diversion. It was a big mistake for the French state when that happened, I agree, but this is not the biggest issue. The biggest issue is that just up the road, again, a few days ago, 3 men with machetes went through a London street hacking at people saying this is for Allah. Okay? That's our problem. And this is always the way with this. We always have diversions, and some of these diversions we bring upon ourselves. But let me just get back to the main point. We have had historically massive issues in Europe. Nobody who knows anything about our history wouldn't pretend that. But this is a civil war within a religion which was not our war, and it has become our war. It has become our war, and Elif, you are right and wrong. You are totally wrong to say that there isn't some agreement on this. If you are a Muslim and you follow Islam, you believe that the Quran came from God, and you believe that what is in it is at least very hard to run against. And so now we have a situation in a country like this one, where actually the majority of British Muslims want being gay, like I am, to be made illegal now, okay? So we had a nice liberal agreement in recent decades over being gay, and now you import a community which actually thinks not just that they're not on board with gay marriage, but they think it should be made a lock-upable offence. Where does that come from? It comes from Islam, okay? where do all these things come from? They come from this, and I'm sorry, but it is a much worse problem than we think. Okay, one poll last year showed that 50% of British Muslims would not go to the police if they knew somebody involved in an ISIS-like group was around them. Another poll showed 2/3 of British Muslims saying they would not go to the police if they knew somebody involved in extremist activity. What the hell are we doing? What the hell are we doing in ignoring that?
Okay, Douglas. Therefore, the questioner asked, do you support a religious test for immigrants to this country? And I suppose what was in his mind was, if you don't, how on earth would you be able to reduce the flow?
First of all, of course, we've got to remember that we've been talking about asylum a lot, and certainly now the people coming into southern Europe, certainly the Italian points of entry, are not asylum seekers in the way that we're seeing. They're not Syrians. They are economic migrants looking for a better life, and that has always, in recent years, been a massive part of this. And these two things are constantly elided, deliberately elided, and I think dangerously elided. So yes, I could well get on board with a religious test. For instance, in recent years, there has been a significant genocide on our continent, on our planet, rather. Yazidis, who were almost wiped out a couple of years ago. I could certainly get on board with something that prioritized asylum seekers if they're Yazidis, or Coptic Christians.
I can see what you're doing. I can see what you're doing there, Douglas, and that's good. What I'm saying is, would you want a religious test that didn't prioritize Yazidis, everyone finds that admirable, but would actually rule out and prevent Muslims from granting entry into this country?
I can't see the sense in keeping a high level of economic migration from the Muslim world, no.
So yes, a religious test to prevent Muslim migrants.
Secondly, very quickly, the gentleman at the back from Germany. First of all, it's not the case that it's been fine with Turkish migration since the Gastarbeiter period. Merkel herself said in 2010 that it had been a disaster. Then 5 years later, she made the disaster far bigger. But, you know, in 2008, Erdogan went to Germany and spoke to tens of thousands of Turks in Europe from the Netherlands, Belgium, and Germany, and said at a massive public rally, do not integrate, but get involved in politics because we need you. I'm sorry, this is subversion. This is outright subversion of European democracies. So yes, we had a problem. And as for the, as it were, would it matter if 1 in 1 million became a suicide bomber? Again, it's a cost-benefit analysis, isn't it? As long as you're not the one standing outside the wine bar in Ansbach when the suicide bomber goes off, it might be okay for you. It might be okay, and it seems to be for most people in our political parties in Britain, it might be okay for you to not worry about this identity question, not worry about the numbers, but you've just got to hope your kids don't like Ariana Grande and go on the wrong night. But I think the cost-benefit analysis of this has to be weighed up, and if you do think that, then say it. Say, we'll take a suicide bombing every now and then. We'll take the stabbings every now and then. Sure.
Christine.
Thank you very much. Tariq says that Europeans associate Islam with violence. There is some truth in that. There is also a very obvious reason for that, which is that Islam is associated with violence. It was not Buddhists who flew planes into the Twin Towers. It was not Hindus or Jews that blew up the London Underground in buses a few years ago. And that simple fact has to be acknowledged if you're even going to start a dialogue. Now, what is happening, ladies and gentlemen, it's not a pantomime. I'd argue that Europe has done not too badly, considering the circumstances. In the middle of the last century, there was an almost negligible Muslim presence in Europe. At the turn of the 21st, in Western Europe alone, there were 15 to 17 million Muslims. That's a very fast migration, ladies and gentlemen, one of the fastest in human history. And no society would find it easy to deal with that kind of migration. As it happens, European societies, Western European societies have, I think, dealt with this much better than some would. Certainly, Muslims coming to live in Britain and in Western Europe enjoy more rights and better rights, among them freedom of worship, than they do in any Islamic country in the earth here today. We do have a problem. We have a problem when the failures of Islam throughout the world, the failures of all Islamic societies come here into Britain. Their intolerance of freedom of conscience, their intolerance of apostates, their intolerance of freedom of expression and freedom of speech.
their intolerance of minorities, other religious minorities, sexual minorities, their intolerance of gays, their dislike and distrust of half of the population, women, and many, many other things. And the call, what's more, for a parallel legal system within Britain and European societies. This is monstrous. No other group behaves like this, asks for parallel laws. This is a fundamental problem, and it's one we're going to have to deal with. It's a problem between a society, Western Europe, that believes that laws are based on reason, and Islam that believes that they are based on revelation. Between these two ideas, I'm not sure there is very much compromise for Europe. It is not Europe that has let down its Muslims, but the Muslims of Europe that have let down Europe. This is not solely something which we have to say we can never reconcile. Of course we can reconcile this, but we need to be honest about it. We need to be frank about it, and we cannot avoid things just because they are unpleasant. And if there were one thing I would wish Muslims in Europe could learn today, as fast as possible, it would be this: that you have no right in this society not to be offended. You have no right to say that because you don't like something, you can commit violence, or you would like something to be stopped or censored. You have no right to have more hate laws or hate crime laws or hate speech laws just to defend Islam. You have to realize, the Muslims of Europe have to realize, that a society in which even your deepest feelings can be trodden upon is the only society worth living in. And the sooner we can learn that, the sooner that Islam can learn that within Europe, the better. It is not Europe that has failed its Muslims. It is Islam that has failed Europe. I'd argue Islam has failed its Muslims. Thank you.
I'm not an academic or a politician, which may mean precarious things career-wise, but it means at least I don't have to ever be politically correct, and I hope I won't be today. I'm going to take my text from Alice in Wonderland, which is one of the best texts to understand what's happening in Europe at the moment. And you'll all remember the conversation between Alice and the White Queen, when the White Queen tries to urge Alice to practice thinking of impossible things. And Alice says, one can't think of impossible things. And the White Queen says, nonsense. When I was your age, I used to spend at least half an hour a morning thinking impossible things. Why, I used to be able to think of at least 6 impossible things before breakfast. Well, Europeans are expected to think far more than 6 impossible things before breakfast these days, and I could be here all day if I wanted to list all of the impossible things that you and I are expected to believe. But let me just go over 4 of the impossible things which we're meant to believe, and I'll do them as briefly as I can. The first of the impossible things which we're asked to believe is that Islam is a peaceful religion. It's very evidently not. No religion is entirely peaceful, but Islam is especially not peaceful. We are, of course, always reminded that there is a problem of authority within Islam, and that is certainly true. But it also means that the sources matter even more than those of any other religion, because it means that the source is what you have to go on. It means that the source will most likely always trump any organization or any individual who claims to speak for the religion more than the sources. That's why, as the professor said at the beginning, the life of Muhammad is so important if one is going to understand this. And as the professor said, when Muhammad was weak, he was more generous. When he was strong, that generosity palpably, visibly declined somewhat. And we see a similar thing in the world today, and we see a similar thing, I would argue, not only in Islamic societies, but within Islamic communities in European societies. When Islam is in a minority, it speaks a very great deal about minority rights. We cannot help noticing that when Islam is in a majority, or at least in a position to rule, those minority rights go out of the window. Minority rights of sexual minorities, the minority rights of religious minorities, and so on. The problem, which this boils down to, I'll be as brief as possible on it, is that Europeans cannot accept the fact
that what ISIS and other terrorists do is very obviously the worst possible interpretation of Islam. It is obviously the worst possible interpretation of Islam for Muslims worldwide, and it is obviously the very worst version of Islam possible for non-Muslims worldwide. Nevertheless, it is a plausible interpretation of the texts in front of them and the tradition from which they come. And if you doubt that, I would urge you to consider one particular source, which if there is an authority within the Muslim world you might turn to, and that is the University of AlAzhar in Cairo. And I'm very sorry that both the Egyptian ambassador and also our friend from the Fatwa Council are absent now. But if you look at what happened last December, a year ago, a young Jordanian pilot shot down over ISIS-controlled territory. And you'll remember that he was burned alive brutally by the maniacs of ISIS. That young man was a Muslim himself, and the people of ISIS claimed to be acting in the name of Islam as well. AlAzhar in Cairo had an extraordinary debate about this, one aspect of which was this, that the senior clerics said that what had happened should be punished, that the people who did that and burned that brave young Muslim Jordanian pilot should be punished. They should be punished, incidentally, by either being crucified or by having alternate legs and arms cut off. This was because they had broken the Islamic prohibition on the desecration of a body. You might think that crucifixion somewhat broke that prohibition as well. But they also said, very strikingly, that the thing to bear in mind about ISIS was that they were indeed terrorists, they were indeed extremists, but, quote, not to be described as heretics. Just a couple of days ago, one of very distinguished scholars, graduates of AlAzhar, Sheikh Mohammed Abdullah Nasra, gave a televised interview in which he was asked why AlAzhar is in the habit of denouncing secular thinkers as un-Islamic, but refuses to denounce the Islamic State as un-Islamic. And Sheikh Nasra said, quote, AlAzhar can't condemn the Islamic State as un-Islamic. The Islamic State is a byproduct of AlAzhar's programs. So how can AlAzhar denounce itself as un-Islamic? This, I simply present it as, is a very significant problem. Nevertheless, we are invited to believe the impossible and to believe every day before breakfast that Islam is a religion of peace and that there's nothing else to see. The second thing we're invited to believe that is obviously impossible is that multiculturalism works. Now, it's a very striking thing that 5 years ago, as Daniel Johnson referred to, Angela Merkel said that multiculturalism had failed. 4 years ago, President Sarkozy and Prime Minister Cameron also said that multiculturalism had failed. Yet we as Europeans are invited to believe that when migration was at a relative low point, multiculturalism had failed, whereas when migration was at such a historic high as it currently is, it could possibly work. This is a very impossible thing to believe. We're also invited to believe that the numbers don't matter, that the quantity of people coming in would not in any way particularly affect your society. There is a figure that I can't help trotting out on such occasions when I hear such things. We are often told in Britain, and I know across Europe people are told, that we are all migrant societies. This is not true. It is a bit of casuistry we've been invited to engage in. But it is true that we have had immigration throughout our history. But if you consider that the largest migration that people still speak about in Britain over recent centuries was 4 centuries ago when in 1683, in the aftermath of 1683, more than 50,000 Huguenots, French Protestants, came to the United Kingdom. Such a large migration that people still talk about it. From 1997 onwards, 50,000 immigrants was about 6 weeks of average immigration into the UK. So the numbers clearly do matter in some way, and they obviously matter as well because of a density question. Nobody in any of our countries has worked out what to do about, as it were, dispersing people who arrive in such large numbers. And the result, in different ways, in Paris, in Germany, and in England and elsewhere, is you effectively get ghettos. These ghettos have all sorts of negative things to do with them, but one which is not noted enough, I would say, but I would give one figure to you that may be relevant, is the extent to which they can cause radicalization themselves.
If you go through the figures that my think tank has produced from every single person convicted, not suspected, but convicted of terrorism-related offences in the UK, 9 out of 10 of those people who have been convicted of Islamic terrorism offences come from areas where the population is between 25 and 50% Muslim. That is around 7 to 10 times the national average. That is not a coincidence. It is a byproduct of a density of population. We're also, the fourth impossible thing we're invited to believe is that the identity of immigrants into our societies does not matter. Now, in the UK, in the wake of the atrocities in January in Paris, a poll was conducted of British Muslims, which found that 27% of British Muslims had some sympathy with the people who had gone into the offices of Charlie Hebdo and massacred 10 journalists and 2 policemen. They had some sympathy with that. Now, when I was in Denmark a few months ago speaking at the Parliament for the 10th anniversary of the Danish cartoons affair, I was very struck by speaking to a Danish politician who said that she didn't want any more Muslim immigrants in Denmark. And I said, are you sure, that's a somewhat clear, but arguably too clear policy? She said, no, why should we? Because for every 100 immigrants we bring in, there will be at least 70 who don't believe we should publish cartoons and want to limit what we say and speak about and what we publish in our newspapers. And it's a difficult argument to refute. Angela Merkel, I gather in recent days, has been in touch with the Israeli government to try to find out how the Israelis absorbed so many people into their society so successfully in recent decades. Of course, one of the reasons why they've been able to do that is because the people coming to Israel are Jewish. It may well come as a great shock to Angela Merkel that the 1 million people she's let into her country this year are not all German Lutherans. But if you believe, as most people do now, that there is at least a proportion of this community, and we must always remember only a proportion, not a majority, but a proportion of this community that is a problem. Let's go to the lowest possible proportion. Let's pretend that only 1% of that community has any bad ideas or bad intent towards our society. Let's just pretend 1%. Nobody can tell us why 1% of, say, 2 million people is a problem, but 1% of 4 million or 5 million people is not. This is an impossible thing. So we're asked to fib ourselves. We console ourselves with lies. We have been in Europe rewriting, among other things, our past. At any historical discussion now, anywhere in Europe, there is always somebody who raises, quite often, quite a lot of people who raise, for instance, the issue of the Islamic neoplatonists, a very interesting corner of history. But this now bears an unbelievable load historically. People argue that the Islamic Neoplatonists are what we owe our entire civilization to, that we would be in the Dark Ages if it weren't for the Islamic Neoplatonists. At a recent event at the European Parliament I was speaking at, one of the members of the European Commission waved a copy of a book called 1001 Islamic Inventions. This, he doesn't know, is an act of dawah by the Muslim Brotherhood. But in any case, he waved this book, 1001 Islamic Inventions, which has toured the world, went even to the Science Museum in Britain, the exhibition of the book, and it's entirely fictional. But it's consoling to us. It says that Islam invented almost everything in the world. It invented cities, it invented agriculture, it invented free thought. It even says at one point that Muhammad invented the toothbrush. I'm never quite sure why they need to throw that one in. But it basically says it rewrites our societies. It rewrites our societies in an Islamic slant so that we actually owe our society to Islam. This is a lie we tell ourselves simply in order to try to get by in the situation created for us by our politicians. We then also pretend to ourselves that our values are shared by everyone, when anybody who speaks to any arrival from the Middle East will know, anybody in the Middle East will know that clearly many things, as Daniel Johnson again said, that we take for granted in Europe are most certainly not taken for granted by people in the Middle East, or let alone from sub-Saharan Africa, where such a large number of the migrants now come from. But we also fib ourselves by trying to change our present. One of the bits of casuistry which a lot of particularly secular thinkers do at the moment is to say after, for instance, a terrorist assault like that in Paris the other week, that the response must be that we abandon all faith schools, for instance. That in response to a terrorist atrocity we must attack all religion, or deracinate a religious identity from the religious square. This is a very perverse way of ignoring a problem. It means that after somebody goes into a theatre in Paris with Kalashnikovs and suicide belts, you should shut Anglican state schools in the UK. This makes absolutely no sense. It makes no sense to strip ourselves of our own identity in response to a clear terrorist threat. The other option, of course, is that we give up some of our rights. I was disturbed to hear the references earlier to Charlie Hebdo and the references to these cartoons as abusive and primitive. Abusive and primitive cartoons are something that published every single day in all of the press. I'm sure that your Prime Minister here can tell us something about abusive cartoons. Certainly the Prime Ministers in France, Britain and elsewhere can. Abusive cartoons and abusive speech is protected, it is a right, it is something we can do, partly because such speech is often correct. But we volunteer to give up a bit of that. We will, for instance, critique all religions bravely, but not Islam. This is a very great mistake. And the other thing we do, of course, is that we give excuses to the extremists which they never even asked for. Somebody referred earlier to the risk of a lack of opportunity. Take the Zarneev brothers, the two brothers originally from Dagestan who went to America with their family 20 years ago. They were given absolutely everything as asylum seekers and as refugees by America. They were given their education, they were given their housing, they were given allowances, they went to university, but they put bombs at the finish line of the Boston Marathon. There was no lack of opportunity, no lack of generosity, no cold-heartedness. It was something quite different. I'm going to wrap up by saying that, by the way, not a day goes by where you can't also at least have a grim laugh about this. Today, it was provided once again by Saudi Arabia. The Saudi Defense Minister, Mohammed bin Salman, this morning announced a 34-country anti-terror coalition that he was helping to put together. And he announced this, it's very unclear what it actually consists of. He announced this by saying, quote, "Currently every Muslim country is fighting terrorism individually, so coordinating is very important." It really does require a heart of stone not to laugh. If the Saudi government wants to find the causes of extremism, it can find them in its own house and palaces. It doesn't need to look around the world for them. So what do we do? Very quickly, 5 things. The first is, I think, to acknowledge that mass migration of the scale we've seen in recent years has been a great mistake. It has been a historic mistake, and we are still dealing with the consequences of it. A second thing would be to stop the mass migration. That isn't to say stop all immigration, but to stop the mass migration which is going on at the moment. A third is to acknowledge that the Muslim world is going through a civil war. It's an extremely complex civil war, and it's possible, very likely, it will outlive all of us. But therefore, it's very important that we try to any extent we can, protect ourselves from it, to shield ourselves from it, and to try to hold it off in order that our own societies do not become completely absorbed by that civil war. We try to absorb, fourthly, those people who are already here, and fifthly, we try, as somebody said earlier, to reconstruct our own societies. After decades of deconstruction from the academies and elsewhere, to reconstruct our societies. And to say we do not have to rewrite our past and our present. We do not have to be made to think impossible things. There are many, many things which we should be thinking about, and many, many good things we have that we would like to keep them, and that there is nothing wrong about saying so. Thank you. That politicians have all tried to keep up this facade that the Islamic blasphemy police have nothing to do with Islam, the jihadists have nothing to do with Islam, Islam has nothing to do with Islam. During the same period, the publics of the West have come to totally different conclusions.
Let me get back to the main point which you've been trying to divert us from. That's this. What is going on with this is an attempt not to make Islam be treated differently, not making Charlie Hebdo. It wasn't to treat Islam differently or Muhammad. It was to treat Islam exactly the same way that secular free people have the right to talk about every religion. And this gentleman and others are trying through the front door, some people through the front door with Kalashnikovs and others through the back door with this kind of weasel talk. What they do is try to make one religion free from being able to be criticised, and it must be stopped.